Hello and welcome to a special coverage on the death of Nelson Mandela here at BBC World News with me, Martine Dennis.
And with me, Alice Baxter. We're broadcasting to viewers all around the world on this momentous day. Well, this is the scene live in Johannesburg, in the northern suburb of Houghton, where Mandela lived, where crowds have sung and danced all night and morning to mourn his passing and celebrate his life. Well, the BBC's Milton and Cozy is outside Nelson Mandela's family home in the Johannesburg suburb of Houghton, and let's cross live to him now. Milton, we've seen people dancing outside of that house. Why are they dancing?
Well, this is a celebration of Nelson Mandela's life by some of the supporters of the African National Congress. You will recall that Mr. Mandela led the ANC for many years, and he led the ANC into power here when he became the first democratically elected president in 1994. So these people have come here to sing and hold a vigil. We are now going to show you just a small group here who are still singing. They started very late at night and they are still continuing even now. The sun has come up here. This has been going on all night. They are singing old liberation songs, praising Mr. Mandela, talking about the apartheid era, and one of the songs that they've been singing is an amazingly beautiful song saying, "Nelson Mandela, there is no one else like you." And they repeat that verse so many times that it begins to have an effect on you. I saw some runners who woke up in the morning for their daily run and only to discover that Nelson Mandela has died because they went to bed too early, I suppose, because the news came out when President Zuma announced that Mr. Mandela died. That was at about 11:30 last night in South African time.
And they certainly seem to show no signs of wanting to leave anytime soon, do they, Milton? Wanting to leave the bedside of a man that they call the father of the nation. Have we been hearing any renditions of Nkosi Sikolele, the anthem, which of course so famously changed under the leadership of Nelson Mandela?
They sang it in its various forms. They sang it in its liberating or liberation tradition, where it has no mix with the stem, the other national anthem. Remember, when Mr. Mandela came for the sake of reconciliation, they combined the two anthems. So this group has been singing the old version, the new version, to try and accommodate everyone. And I saw an amazing presence here of black and white faces, something you wouldn't have seen before the end of apartheid here. And remember, Nelson Mandela made one of the most amazing gestures when he came out of prison. He invited the prosecutor who sent him to prison in 1964 for tea when he was president.
And of course, Milton, that was reflected, that total lack of bitterness in his character, in the tributes that have been paid to him, most notably, of course, by F.W. de Klerk himself, who was the last president of the apartheid regime, his fellow winner of the Nobel Peace Prize. He really praised that aspect to Madiba's character, didn't he?
Yes, indeed. And of course, you will recall that Mr. Mandela shared the Nobel Peace Prize in 1993 with F.W. de Klerk because simply Mr. Mandela averted a bloodbath here when there was a possible bloodbath between the black and the white communities of South Africa. And millions of South Africans are grateful this morning, and as they were in 1994, that Mr. Mandela liberated them from racial oppression. But when he did that, simultaneously, he liberated his jailers, because he told them, let bygones be bygones. And that's why this morning here, people are still singing many hours after the announcement was made.
And Milton, I just want you to remind our viewers again of that extraordinarily happy time in South African history when Nelson Mandela was able to walk out after the Rugby World Cup in 1995 and announce that his Rainbow Nation had won the World Cup. I was at school at the time in South Africa, and I remember watching it with my classmates, and we were crying with happiness. It was such a special time, wasn't it?
very much so. So many memories are flooding back as we stand here outside his house. Remember, he was just in one of those bedrooms there where you see those windows. He, on that day that you're mentioning of the Rugby World Cup in 1995, he turned up in the dressing room for the Springboks, a rugby team which was largely supported and filled by a white team. And he turned up in the captain's jersey number 6. And when they won the World Cup, he walked up there to hand over the cup. And the announcer said, a great crowd of 40,000 to Francois Pienaar, who was the captain. And he answered, no, we have 40 million supporters. And Nelson was standing there. And it was the most amazing thing to see that year, because it was the first year of his presidency, watching all those white people shouting, Nelson, Nelson, Nelson. And that's what's going on here even today.
Oh, thank you for reminding us of that truly remarkable day, Milton. I don't think we've heard from Francois Pienaar himself yet, but I'm sure we will imminently. Milton, many thanks for bringing us that scene live from outside Nelson Mandela's home in Houghton in northern Johannesburg. A really special scene, all those people dancing through the night.
Well, Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in total.
Yeah, be sure not to miss that. Now, Peter Fabricius is the foreign editor at the independent newspapers in South Africa, and he joins me live now on the line from Johannesburg. Many thanks for joining us here on the programme. Peter, you spent a huge part of your career, of course, following and writing about Nelson Mandela. What do you feel today about the man?
I guess that in a moment like this, one feels not as a journalist, but as just an ordinary South African, you know, which is to say very, 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 very sad, very emotional. It's very difficult to measure the significance of Mandela in all our lives, just except that it was immense, you know. I think some people have tended to sort of downplay his role retrospectively, because they say that he focused too much on reconciliation and look at the inequalities that still exist. I mean, I think Mandela did his part and much, much more. The reconciliation, carrying the country across the Great Divide from apartheid to democracy was a huge, huge achievement and very difficult to overestimate that.
And Peter, reconciliation, that's a word that we keep hearing again and again from people that we're talking to here at the BBC when they remember the achievements of Mandela. Reconciliation, unifying, those seem to be his major goals and his major achievements. But I'd also like to hear your thoughts about perhaps the difference in the way Mandela, or Madiba as he's known in South Africa, is thought of both within South Africa and abroad. You wrote back in June that Mandela is perhaps, quote, more revered by foreigners and for obvious reasons white South Africans than by many black South Africans. What did you mean by that?
You know, in that article, and I guess it could be regarded as a controversial opinion, I was referring to particularly some views allegedly expressed by his former wife, Winnie Madikizela Mandela, who I think represented quite a substantial part of, I guess you could say, the slightly more radical black opinion, which was the opinion that I referred to earlier, that he'd been Mandela had in a sense been sort of overrated because he hadn't brought economic equality to South Africa. He brought political democracy, and I just believe that's why I believe that, and there are quite a people of that ilk, black people, who sort of rather scornfully tended to say, well, you know, he's the white hero for obvious reasons, that he, you know, that he saved our skins as white people. But you know, I think that underestimates a whole lot of things. It underestimates, for example, the fact that, you know, he was the man, one of the members of the ANC Youth League who moved the ANC to the armed struggle back in 1961, you know, when all our other measures to try to persuade the apartheid government to introduce democracy had failed, you know. So, you know, what I think of Mandela is a person who had the courage and the vision to use the appropriate tools at the appropriate time.
I mean, let's just talk about some of those hugely symbolic, unifying gestures that Mandela demonstrated during his lifetime. You know, wearing the number 6 green jersey at the World Cup final in '95, and having tea with Betsy Favor, the widow of what many people consider to be his jailer, if you like. Talk us through the memories of those actions.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And of course, inviting his jailers to his inauguration. You know, my own little personal memory of that was when I was based in the United States in 1994, and he came over on a state visit, and there was a big reception for him at the embassy, the South African embassy in Washington. And of course, most of the people in the crowd were like the civil rights people who protested outside the embassy against his imprisonment and against apartheid. And so when we all stood to sing the national anthem, we sang the first part, which was the ANC anthem, and then everybody stopped. And Mandela then said, "Excuse me, you haven't completed the anthem," and made everybody continue singing what was the anthem of apartheid, which is the second part of our anthem. And that, to me, just sort of epitomized who he was about. He had a mission, and it wasn't. As some people think, just an emotional thing, this reconciliation. It was a strategic decision of huge significance and success.
Indeed, and you make the point in your writing again, and it's a point that was made by Tony Blair, actually, when he spoke to our reporter John Sopel earlier, that he was a very astute politician, as well as being hugely symbolically important. He was so many things, wasn't he? Peter Fabricius, foreign editor for independent newspapers, many thanks for sharing your memories of Nelson Mandela with us today. And it's interesting that Peter just then was mentioning the importance that music played in terms of the national anthem, and music right now in remembering Nelson Mandela playing such a huge part. We're just looking at these live pictures now of Soweto, of outside the Mandela family home, where people have been throughout the night and throughout the morning, singing and toying, dancing, if you like, remembering Nelson Mandela and celebrating his life. And Martine, I know that this is something that really resonates with you.
Indeed, Alice. In fact,
well, she began her career as a reporter in her native South Africa, later becoming the anchor on the country's News at 10. She joins us live now from Nairobi. Lerato, seeing those wonderful pictures that we were just seeing of that toying outside of Nelson Mandela's house in Houghton in northern Johannesburg, you must be feeling a long way from home right now.
I am feeling a long way from home, but not too far away from the story. I've just woken up to commemorations and tributes by the Kenyan media. Popular TV station KTN says, "Fare thee well, Madiba," referring to him by his clan name that we know so well in South Africa. The Daily Nation, which is a newspaper with the widest circulation here in Kenya, it says a freedom icon, Nelson Mandela, dies at 95 and proceeds with a detailed biography of his life and his values. The Tanzanian president, not too far away, has declared 3 days of national mourning. And further afield in West Africa, President Goodluck Jonathan has spoken and said all oppressed peoples of the world will remember Nelson Mandela. So Africa's waking up to the story of the death of Africa's greatest statesman, but celebrating his life and his values. And you're right to remind us of his economic legacy, because as Africa rises in a new era of economic growth and development, the leadership must look to people like Nelson Mandela for values of economic justice and social inclusion, because at the core of his economic policies when he took over as president of South Africa in 1994, that was the bedrock of his economic vision, is a society where all can participate and where all have the freedom to earn an income and create the lives that they deem fit.
As you say, Lerato, Mandela was always very clear that economic prosperity and change was intrinsic to equality and the dismantling of the apartheid system for all South Africans. And he oversaw, didn't he, the move towards a market economy at a time when many within the ANC were still very wedded to this almost communist type economic structure that had existed. And one of the most important changes he oversaw was the dismantling of this homeland system. Just describe what that was, if you will.
I think Nelson Mandela could be described as one of the earlier of the social democrats. It was quite fashionable in the 1990s to describe yourself as that. Nelson Mandela was one of those who was very much the pioneer of that kind of economic program that supports the free market, but ensures that dividends and profits are redistributed to those who are more vulnerable in society. The homeland system in South Africa was about segregated land ownership, and more than that, it was about putting people according to their ethnic persuasions into regions where they can develop separately from other people. So the Bantu education system, the Group Areas Act, the Homeland System was about not just ensuring that black people develop separately to white people, but even within the black community, ethnicities were also separated. And Nelson Mandela said an economy can't thrive on that level of marginalization. You need inclusion, you need the free flow of labor, and people who live on the land must own and work that land.
And the results speak for themselves, don't they, Loretta? Economic growth rates more than doubled under his presidency. Average incomes rose sharply for both black and white South Africans. And yet, the disparity between the rich and the poor in South Africa is greater than ever. Unemployment is still too high. We've seen this radicalization of the trade unions, increasing numbers of strikes at mines, for example. We've seen the rand, the currency, plummet in value. Was enough done? Can we lay that at Mandela's door, or is this the fault of his successors?
The ANC, which is the ruling party in South Africa since freedom and liberation in 1994, has always said that they operate on a system of collective leadership. It's not an individual. As a collective, they decide economic policy. Under Nelson Mandela, we saw, as I said, a form of social democracy, free market, but redistribution. And there was the introduction of the RDP, the Reconstruction and Development Program, predicated on free healthcare, free education, and also job access. It didn't work out very well. So in later years, and the post-Mandela administration had to have a revisioning of economic programs. Then we saw GEAR, the growth, employment, redistribution program, which was looking at ways to accelerate job creation and also conscientize business a little bit more. It is in that era that we saw fantastic growth rates in South Africa. After that, unfortunately, were exogenous forces, the global market crash of 2008. South Africa wasn't exempted because of all African economies, it is the most exposed. And since then, South Africa has been struggling with its own recovery, and that has exacerbated issues such as unemployment. But compounding the problem were some of the broader questions about the weak capacity of the state to redistribute the things that it's decided are important. And in it, issues like corruption came to the fore. So it's quite a complex issue why the South African economy is underperforming. It's economic policy on one side, it's leadership on another side, and it's a loss of moral credibility in many areas as well. And that cannot be placed at Nelson Mandela's door.
Many thanks for joining us. You served in South Africa for 4 years. You obviously worked very closely with Nelson Mandela. What are your memories of the man?
My first memory is way, way back, shortly after his release in Geneva, when I was a Methodist lay preacher and representing the World Council of Churches. And he came to the World Council of Churches to thank the church globally for standing by him, his family, and the struggle of the people of South Africa against apartheid, at a time in which he was widely vilified as a terrorist. I mean, I can remember in this country when people on the right were wearing T-shirts saying, "Hang Nelson Mandela." So we see him now as this globally loved icon. The reality is that this was a great man, a moral, a visionary leader who was first and foremost an activist. He was an activist for justice, a bridge for peace. And you just got that sense when you were in his presence, as I was then in Geneva and then subsequently in South Africa and as a cabinet minister here in the UK during his visits. A man full of love, in his smile, in his action, in his every action. So he'd come into a room and everyone there, whether they were serving the meal, whether they were kids who'd been brought by doting grandparents just to be in his presence, he had a word for them. he had something to say to them, he reached out to them. Nelson Mandela's gift was not just to South Africa and Africa, it was to the world. Hope can come out of despair. Transformation is possible when good is allowed to triumph.
Hence the huge numbers of memories and thanks that we've received from around the world. But Paul, I also wanted to hear your thoughts on Nelson Mandela's role in Zimbabwe during that time that you were there, because you served at a very critical time in Zimbabwe's history and you were closely involved in the attempted negotiations between both sides in Zimbabwe. What did Nelson Mandela make of what was happening in that country at that time?
I think one has to understand that that generation of leadership was in the struggle together. The generation of leadership that included Nelson Mandela, Robert Mugabe, Kenneth Kaunda, Julius Nyerere, Auguste Neto, Samara Machel, President dos Santos of Angola. They fought against the embodiment of evil and racism together. So there was always that degree of solidarity. That's an undoubted fact, and we should not forget that for many in Africa, Mugabe remains a hero because he fought. But there was a slight tension always between Mandela and Mugabe. And it's true to say that he once made this comment about Robert Mugabe. Nelson Mandela made this comment. Yes, Robert Mugabe, he was a star in Africa, and then the sun came out. Now that says a great deal about the relationship between the two men, and also about how Madiba saw himself in the context of that wider liberation struggle. It is Nelson Mandela who is the consummate moral and political leader of the struggle. But all played their part and all are given respect in Africa, and we should never ever lose sight of that. No point in demonizing Robert Mugabe. We just need to recognize that Nelson Mandela stood for the very best in us all, African, non-African, white, black alike.
Indeed he did. Paul Batang, former British High Commissioner to South Africa, many thanks for coming in and sharing your memories and your experiences with us. Many thanks.
Well, as everybody knows, he spent 27 years behind bars and thereby became the world's most famous political prisoner. But for the apartheid government, his incarceration only merely served to shine an even brighter light on the struggle for freedom that he and so many others were fighting for.
Well, the prison years saw his stature grow in South Africa and, of course, all across the world. Our correspondent Mike Waldridge looks back now on the time that he spent. Well, let's take you live now to the scene in Johannesburg, in the northern suburb of Houghton, where Nelson Mandela lived. This is the scene outside of his house. Of course, it's coming into the early morning in South Africa now, and people have been camped outside of that house since last night when it was announced that Madiba, as he's known in South Africa, had died. People have been on the streets dancing throughout the night in celebration of his life. That is where his body currently is. It's where Nelson Mandela died last night, surrounded by his wife and his family. Throughout the course of the evening and the night, family members have been arriving. We've seen a lot of activity outside of that house, and of course it's become this real focus for South Africans to come and to celebrate the life of this extraordinary 95-year-old, the father of the nation, as he's often called, this great unifier of all South Africans, of all race. And as we can see, the dancing and the celebrations of a life lived to the full show no signs of diminishing anytime soon. Well, around the world, people have been reacting also to the death of Nelson Mandela. Members of the public have been paying tribute, as well as current and former political leaders, sports stars and celebrities, showing the reach and the popularity of Madiba, well outside of the confounds of Houghton, where he lived in the northern suburb of Johannesburg. Here now is our diplomatic correspondent, Bridget Kendall.
Welcome to a special programme here at BBC World News with me, Martine Dennis, and Alice Baxter.
Well, just over 7 hours ago now, it was confirmed that Nelson Mandela had died.
Mr Mandela, who was 95, had been receiving intensive care at his home in a northern suburb of Houghton in Johannesburg after suffering a lung infection. He was imprisoned by the South African government for 27 years during the apartheid era. By the time he gained his freedom in 1990, Mr Mandela had captured the imagination of people around the world.
Well, he became the first black leader of Africa's biggest economy in 1994 after historic all-race elections. Well, Mr Mandela stepped down as president in 1999 after just one term in office. His last appearance in public was at the final of the Football World Cup in Johannesburg in 2010.
Well, Gabriel Gatehouse reports now from Johannesburg.